Hello, everyone. With the current pace of biodiversity loss, we are at a risk of losing over 1 million species. We may trigger irreversible knock-on effects that put also business models at risk. Now, you might be surprised to know that our economy depends on nature. Nature provides the land and resources essential for our economy and for our recovery from the economic crisis. According to the World Economic Forum, $44 trillion of economic value generation is moderately or highly exposed to nature loss. A recent landmark study by the Dutch Central Bank, Indebted to Nature, it's called, found out that Dutch financial institutions alone have $510 billion of exposure to biodiversity risks. But what worries me most is not the sheer value of the risks, but the lack of understanding and knowledge of them. Only very few companies or financial organizations are capable of identifying and measuring their impacts or dependencies on nature and biodiversity. And we are lacking common metrics and methods to value nature. Today's business management information system focuses on financial performance. These are not adequately accounting for the relation with nature, nor are they adequately supporting information to customers and investors about the impacts of businesses on nature. The natural resources and ecosystems that power businesses and underpin economies and communities are indeed under a huge strain. But as it always happens, unless we can measure the scale of the problem, we cannot manage it very well. The COVID-19 pandemic opened our eyes to the potential consequences of tampering with nature and wildlife. The relationship between biodiversity and infectious disease is complex, but we do know that the encroachment of human activities into and destruction of ecosystems increase the risk of emergence and spread of zoonotic diseases. This pandemic has raised awareness that nature and biodiversity loss and human health are interdependent. The recovery from COVID-19 offers a chance to rebuild a regenerative and interconnected economic, financial, and natural systems that are fully resilient. To do that, we need the right types of investments. Instead of directing the money to investments that will further deteriorate the situation, we need big green investments that restore and protect nature proactively protect and restore biodiversity and also climate simultaneously. The European Green Deal guides all the work of this European Commission mandate. Let's have a look at some of the initiatives. The main aim of the Green Deal is to address the interdependent challenges of climate change, biodiversity loss, natural resources depletion, and pollution. This, we are calling it, our generation's defining task. These interdependent crises must be addressed in a systemic and integrated manner. We cannot solve one problem by creating or exacerbating another. This is why the Green Deal includes a green oath to do no harm. Some questioned whether coming up with an ambitious environmental and climate agenda was the right time during the pandemic that so harshly affected and still continues to affect our economies, health systems, and daily lives. I believe this is the perfect time. The European Green Deal will help us emerge from the emergency in a better way, working with nature and not against it. Under the Green Deal, the European Commission has decided to become carbon neutral by 2050. This is enshrined in the so-called climate law. It lays down measures to make our food system sustainable, the farm-to-fork strategy, to stop and reverse biodiversity loss, the biodiversity strategy, and to address resource depletion, the Circular Economy Action Plan. Soon, in the forthcoming Zero Pollution Action Plan, we will explain how we want to go about addressing pollution. But what is the role of business and entrepreneurs in all this? First of all, it is urgent to put words into action, implementation, is key. Therefore, I am happy to see many front-running companies active on biodiversity and natural capital. And it is no longer a niche activity. Market leaders demonstrate the need to integrate biodiversity into their business strategies and everyday practice. Business coalitions like Business for Nature, One Planet Business for Biodiversity, or the Value Balancing Alliance pilot ways to integrate nature into business decision-making. Forward-thinking businesses understand that healthy societies, resilient economies, and businesses rely on nature. Addressing the nature crisis will actually bring money and jobs, according to the World Economic Forum. If countries and business prioritize nature, we could generate nearly 400 million jobs. And this not by 1,000 years, it's just in a decade, by 2030. And $10.1 trillion in annual business value. That's a lot of jobs and a lot of money for the recovering economies. The Business for Nature Coalition showcases at least 530 front-running businesses that have already made commitments to help reverse nature loss across a variety of international, regional, and sectoral problems, and more than 1,200 companies investing in protecting and restoring nature and reducing their negative impacts. We must continue to build on these examples and bring everyone on board. To make business part of the solution, it is essential that all business managers understand that there are not only impacts, but also dependencies on nature. And we need to speak with the same language through aligned approaches and generally accepted principles to account for natural capital and biodiversity. The Commission is playing its part. We are revising the sustainable finance strategy. We are implementing the so-called taxonomy regulation, defining sustainable investments. We are reviewing the non-financial reporting directive with a view to improving the quality and scope of non-financial disclosures, including on environmental aspects such as biodiversity. And we are working on an initiative on green claims, enabling better informed choices by customers based on robust assessment methodologies. The EU Business and Biodiversity Platform is now prioritizing biodiversity measurement approaches in use by business, including a focus on SMEs and their specific needs to engage on biodiversity. And our upcoming project, called Align, will work on aligning accounting principles, accounting approaches for nature, in close cooperation with front-running companies who are sharing their business experience as a role model for all others. We hope that this work will intensify business engagement in natural capital management accounting practices and guidelines. However, what we ultimately want to achieve is a new way to inform decisions and ultimately to take them, both in the public and in the private domain, so that biodiversity considerations are better integrated into public and business decision-making. We can see that leading companies increasingly recognize the important role nature and nature-based solutions play in long-term sustainability. They are committing, they are acting, and advocating to reverse nature loss. In particular, for the sectors directly depending on primary production, it should be obvious that healthy ecosystems are crucial to reduce ecological risks to business continuity, financial risks, and reputational risks. Healthy agro-ecosystems embedded in nature are the basis for the food systems. A key message we hear from our front-running business partners is that companies need to be able to assess and measure their impact and their dependencies on nature. Assessing, measuring, valuing, and accounting for nature is the key enabler to manage and reduce the footprint on nature and environmental risks. And yet, biodiversity remains a complex issue, and this is why the EU Business and Biodiversity Platform is prioritizing best practice sharing and assessing in this area. And it is in this space where it became obvious that there is a need for common, aligned approaches and more cooperation. I believe the opportunities and the challenges in measuring biodiversity impacts and dependencies for businesses are a key reason for initiating pre-competitive business cooperation, coalition, and alliances. I have been recently listening to a lot of business leaders, and I have seen many inspiring business initiatives in recent months, not least in the Business and Nature Summit last week. Many companies are already on the move. We need to scale up and speed up these efforts to make business become part of the solution. With the European Union Business and Biodiversity Platform, we are engaging on biodiversity measurement with companies and financial assessing, and aligning the methods developed and piloted by businesses. A key lesson we learned from this work is that there is no longer a lack of tools to measure biodiversity impact of companies. Instead, there are several tools, but there is a lack of aligned or generally accepted methods. I expect our live project Transparent, running with the Value Balancing Alliance, to contribute to finding a solution to that. Together, we shall develop more standardized methods for natural capital accounting. Reversing the loss of nature requires transforming the way we organize our economy, a transformation away from the narrow economic growth paradigm. The measurement of business's relationship with nature has to become the new normal in all business decisions. Earlier, I mentioned the 2050 neutrality and the 2030 targets, and I'd like to share with you some reflections on this. So the climate neutrality objective to be met by 2050, proposed in the recently adopted climate law, is at the core of EU's ambition for a prosperous, resource-efficient, modern, and competitive society. In September, the Commission proposed to reduce greenhouse gas net emissions to at least 55 when compared to the 1990 levels. This is a very significant step up from the target of at least 40%, which is what we say before, and what we committed to under the Paris Agreement. The 55% target was based on an impact assessment that showed that such a reduction in emissions is achievable and beneficial for Europe. Last week, on the 10th to 11th December, the European Council endorsed a binding EU target of a net domestic reduction of at least 55% in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 compared to 1990. The EU's nationally determined contribution provided for in the Paris Agreement will be updated according to the new binding target and submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Secretariat by the end of the year. Ahead of the 26th Conference of the Parties to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which will take place in the UK in 2021, the European Council reiterated that international engagement is crucial to success in addressing climate change and called on all other parties, in particular major economies, to come forward with their own ambitious targets and policies. It underlined the importance of strong coordinated action through active European climate diplomacy. It is in this way that the EU showed once again that it is ready to lead by example in the fight against climate change, as it did in May for biodiversity. But what are the policy and investment needs for all this? Research and innovation will be crucial for decarbonising the EU's economy. It will determine the speed at which the transition can take place, as well as the future competitiveness of the EU's existing and newly emerging industries. The policies aim to incentivise and encourage private sector investments and engage citizens and communities in action for our climate and environment, for example, through the Climate Pact. To drive the transition to climate neutrality, we need sustainable finance and financial instruments or mechanisms that facilitate public and private investments, firstly, and secondly, that give practical support to public authorities and project promoters in planning and designing, and finally, executing sustainable projects. A renewed sustainable finance strategy is planned for adoption in the first quarter of 2021. The EU taxonomy for green activities will provide transparency and will help investors to take informed decisions, avoiding greenwashing. The first delegated act under the taxonomy regulation on climate mitigation and adaptation was published for public feedback on the 20th of November of 2020. Your comments are still very welcome. The platform on sustainable finance has recently been launched and will provide recommendations on the other environmental objectives, namely water, circular economy, pollution, and biodiversity. The European Union's framework for research, Horizon Europe, and the national research programs are well placed to fuel early technology readiness level of low carbon innovation that, when scaled up, can play an important role to keep our industry competitive and to establish Europe as a leader in growing economic sectors. Zero and low carbon innovation will also lead to local job measures such as renovation of existing buildings, insulation, improved reusability and recyclability of construction materials, triggering demand for the workforce in the renovation sector. This is where the Innovation Fund will help. It will bring clean tech innovation to the market. With its over 10 billion euros of support over 10 years, the Innovation Fund will greatly contribute to scaling up clean technologies that will be the very backbone of a decarbonised Europe. The first call of €1 billion attracted 311 projects, which promise to reduce already around 1.2 billion tonnes of CO2 during their operating period within the Innovation Fund. Roughly, this is the equivalent of a third of EU emissions for the whole of 2018. Projects are coming from crucial sectors such as energy, intensive industry, hydrogen, renewables, and carbon capture and storage. A few words now on the Recovery and Resilience Fund, which was recently in the news because of the hiccup that we had in the European budget. The increased climate ambition will require significant additional investments too. Overall annual investments related only to energy production and use will need to increase by around 350 billion per year between 2021 and 2030, compared to what we invested in the decade up to 2020, and by about 90 trillion euros compared to what is needed under the existing policies. The European Green Deal is, however, backed by the largest package ever financed through the EU budget. We will be financing a 750 billion euro recovery and resilience effort through what is being called the Next Generation EU, because this is in fact money borrowed from the next generation. 37% of recovery expenditure will go to European Green Deal objectives such as climate change and biodiversity. Linked to this, 30% of the Next Generation EU will be raised in the markets through green bonds. This represents around 250 billion euros and makes the EU the biggest global issuer of green bonds, which is an unprecedented opportunity. The recovery plan recognizes the urgency of investing in key sectors like the circular economy, the renovation wave, clean transport, sustainable food, clean energy, energy efficiency, and preventing future pandemics. These sectors are also covered in your report. The principle of do no harm lies also at the heart of the Recovery and Resilience Fund. This is because the investments made by member states as part of the Recovery and Resilience plans must avoid any negative impact on the EU's climate and environmental objectives. This applies equally to investments directed at climate action and environmental improvement. For example, investing in climate infrastructure must not destroy biodiversity or must not lead to an increase in water or air pollution, etc. The Commission has already received the draft recovery plans from the Member States and provided comments, notably on the alignment with the Green Deal objectives. But what about the role of technologies? Technologies such as digital and renewables will be a key part of making sure the EU reaches climate neutrality and strengthens its competitiveness globally. The digital and green transitions must be mutually reinforcing. The EU's digital strategy supports digital technologies that can help achieve climate neutrality across all sectors of the EU economy and aims at greening the ICT sector itself. The European Union will seek mutually beneficial alliances and also ensure an international level playing field around new sustainable technologies, such as renewable hydrogen, advanced solar and wind, batteries and carbon capture, as well as around critical raw materials for these technologies, such as rare earths. The EU's position as the world's largest trading bloc provides significant opportunities in this respect. There is, of course, the role of non-technological innovation, because in reality, technological information is only part of the solution to reach our climate and environmental objectives. We also need non-technological innovation, like, for instance, nature-based solutions, social innovation, or sustainable lifestyles. For example, we absolutely need to maintain and increase carbon sinks, such as a well-functioning, healthy ecosystem. Yet we see that carbon sinks are decreasing in Europe and elsewhere. Forest harvesting, on the other hand, is increasing. The condition of forest ecosystems is worsening, and forest fires turn forests, at least temporarily, into carbon sources. Therefore, the Commission proposes massive reforestation and afforestation actions, planting 3 billion trees in full respect of ecological principles, that is, for instance, avoiding practices that are negative for biodiversity and carbon sinks, like monoculture plantations focused on exploitation. Also, under the Circular Economy Action Plan, we want to empower consumers, giving them an accurate information about the footprint of the products that they are about to choose, that they actually choose, and along their life cycle and value chain. Life cycle approaches are indeed critical to measure the actual climate and environmental footprint of our products and future innovations. It is time for action, and entrepreneurship is really key and central to this. The 2030 Climate Target Plan showed that the accelerated transition is not only possible, but it will bring economic, social, and environmental benefits. There were 4 million green jobs in 2016. This was already up from 2.8 million in the year 2000. In the longer term, the transformation will create more durable jobs. The Commission's own analyses indicate that the transition to climate neutrality by 2050 could generate 2.1 million additional jobs, which corresponds to 0.9% increase in employment. This does not mean it will be easy. As with every transformation, there will be winners, there will be losers, and of course, we would need to show solidarity. The European Green Deal calls for not leaving anyone behind and creates the so-called Just Transition Fund, precisely to help those in difficult circumstances. The Recovery and Resilience Plan is also an opportunity to mitigate negative social problems of the transition. Now is the time for implementation. The expansion of renewable energy or the progress of circular economy makes me relatively optimistic about the achievement of our targets and our objectives. The expansion of renewable energy is an example of how a combination of research and innovation, a supportive legislative framework, and financial support can radically change our landscape. The same applies to circular economy, even if progress is still needed. We can do the same to achieve the goals of the Green Deal, also learning from past mistakes, for instance, avoiding negative impacts on the environment of some technologies, reducing our European dependency on specific raw materials. We are now equipped with our experience, and we do have a more holistic approach. In any case, the role of entrepreneurship is key. The EU can create a favorable framework and can financially support initiatives, but the bulk of the job relies on the enterprises themselves, on the local authorities, on NGOs, and civil society in general. I'm also rather confident about the positive role of enterprises. A Eurostat survey of 2014 revealed that the main reason for European enterprises to eco-innovate, for example, by bringing innovations with environmental benefits to the market, was reputation before legislation and the cost of raw materials and energy. Enterprises themselves realize that there is a social pressure to come across as green and responsible. Even if in some cases this can lead to greenwashing, the reputation incentive is also a driver of eco-innovation. And finally, and to conclude, if we empower citizens, giving them a clearer and more transparent information about the footprint of the products they buy, we will also push enterprises to become greener, creating a virtuous circle. That's why empowering consumers is one of the objectives of the new Circular Economy Action Plan. I thank you very much for your kind attention.